Welcome everybody to another in-depth session. I'm really excited to have Chelsea Carey from PointBlue. I think we've all heard a lot about PointBlue, so we're really excited to learn a bit more directly uh, uh, from Chelsea. And those who will be attending the Open Team event in California in a couple weeks will be able to dive in further. But this should be a really good introduction. So with that, I'm gonna let Chelsea introduce herself and in general, if you can mute yourself, and we'll be able to and just unmute if you have a question, and we'll follow up with discussion after Chelsea's done. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Doran. Thank you so much for inviting me to chat with you all. I'm super excited to engage with this group more and to learn from everybody involved and be able to share a little bit more about what we're up to at PointBlue. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Can you all
Looks
see?
good.
Okay. So just a little bit of background about myself. I have been with PointBlue for 3 years now. I am part of our working lands team here, and I focus on studying and sharing information about rangelands, focusing on soil health. I have my PhD from the University of California, Merced, and then I spent some time as a postdoc at UC Riverside before joining PointBlue. My background's in nitrogen cycling and microbial community dynamics, using a lot of different techniques, but I do have quite a bit of experience using molecular techniques, and so it's been fun to try to bring some of that aspect to this work as well. So for those, some of this is going to be a review for a few of you, but for those who don't know, so PointBlue is a nonprofit. We're based out of Petaluma, California, so just north of San Francisco, and we have a staff of about 160 scientists and sort of support staff that focus generally on climate smart conservation. So our mission is to work to advance the conservation of birds and other wildlife and ecosystems, and through science, partnership, and outreach. We started as Point Reyes Bird Observatory over 50 years ago. So we have our origins in ecological monitoring of bird communities as indicators of ecosystem health and change. And since then, we've sort of grown our lens to look at other aspects of the ecosystem. And sort of that's evolved to become focused heavily on climate smart conservation in recent years. So our vision is to is that sort of through climate smart conservation that we will have thriving wildlife and human communities into the future. It's pretty basic. I think a lot of us probably share this vision. And when I think about what climate smart conservation is, I think about building an adaptation and resilience into our ecosystems, and then and helping to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions where possible. So we do this in a lot of different areas. We don't just work on rangelands, and what we bring to the table as a nonprofit is sort of is science. I think this is one of the things that makes us unique, is that we contribute to original research, and we have a long history in sort of doing that through collecting long-term data sets. And so this is just an example of some of the long-term data sets that we have been collecting, and some span, over 50 years since our inception. So collecting bird data at Palomarin Field Station, that's in Point Reyes National Seashore. We have been, as just one other example, collecting data on Adelie penguins in Antarctica for close to 40 years. And we use all of this information to sort of catalyze conservation action across the globe. we work in a 6 different priority areas. So we have projects that span the Sierras to the sea. And like I just mentioned, you know, we're even all the way down into Antarctica. So we have a lot of really gifted staff that work on the challenges that are faced in a lot of these different systems. And I'm going to focus on the working lands one today. So for our Working Lands program, we're a new program within PointBlue that has sort of merged from another of different groups and areas that we had, but it's been sort of formalized in the past year. And you know, our goal is to work with land stewards and other partners to ensure that agricultural landscapes, primarily in California, provide ecosystem services that support the needs of people and wildlife. And you know, since we have our history in bird monitoring, we are sort of, you know, we put a lot of value on wildlife. So when we think about things like climate change mitigation, maximizing, you know, agricultural productivity, we always have a mind towards co-benefits. And I think that this is sort of one of our superpowers or things that we bring to the conversation, or we try to, is how can we find sort of maximize these co-benefits and minimize trade-offs through management across space and time. So for our Working Lands group, we really focus on 3 areas. And at the core of what we do, again, is science. So we conduct original research to inform the metrics and practices and strategies for thriving agroecosystems within California. We use that science, often that goes hand in hand with implementation or stewardship. So a lot of like implementation that we do, we also monitor and do science around it, and try to sort of inform adaptive management through that effort. So we work with producers to demonstrate and implement a lot of conservation strategies on working lands. And then we work, you know, we strive to be sort of a resource for policy. So we don't, you know, directly engage in the way that we often think of from a policy standpoint, you know, we're not at the Capitol all the time, the state Capitol, but we do work with like, you know, very closely with resource agencies and other groups who do go to the Capitol and form these conversations. And so to the extent that we can, we try to inform policy through our science and implementation. And we have a lot of different programs, and I just want to highlight a couple that I'm really not going to go into too much depth on today, but I just want to, I'm going to focus on one sort of program within this. Tomcat Ranch, we're their on-site science partner. So Tomcat Ranch, many of you may be aware of, they're a living learning laboratory, or I think of them as a demonstration ranch, just south of San Francisco, that aims to inspire the transition of 1 million acres to be managed regeneratively in California for rangelands. And so we've been their on-site science partner since 2011, and we help to build out the science and the evidence base for practices that work, scale technologies, you know, sort of vet technologies to scale their adoption, and try to sort of strategically partner with other organizations to inform this conversation in a meaningful way. I'll highlight 2 others. So we do have a Students and Teachers Restoring a Watershed program here at PointBlue, which is pretty neat. So this is a program that implements riparian restoration primarily, and they do it with students and teachers, hence the name. And they've restored, I mean, miles and miles of riparian areas. They've, I think they've implemented something like 600 riparian restorations and engaged thousands of students over the years. So this is sort of a mechanism by which we can, you know, make change through implementation, but also do science around it. So we just got a grant to actually try to help trees like oaks and willows, trees that are ectomycorrhizal, establish better during these riparian restorations, do some trials around that, some science around that. And then the last one I'll just want to flag is that a lot of our staff do help out with the Healthy Soils program in California. So the California Department of Food and Agriculture has a pot of money that goes towards either funding or incentivizing healthy soils practices on farms and ranches, or to fund demonstration projects where you do a little bit more data collection around implementation. And so we provide technical assistance to farmers and ranchers to apply for incentive dollars. And then we also lead a couple of demonstration projects on rangelands across California. So it just gives you a flavor of some of the other stuff that we do that I'm not gonna have time to go into, but certainly, you know, we can talk more about any of this when I finish, if there's interest. The program that I'm going to mostly talk about is our Partner Biologist program and the monitoring that they're able to do, that we're able to do as an organization through this program. So Partner Biologists are PointBlue staff members that are actually also NRCS staff members. So there's we have a cooperative agreement with NRCS. And the salaries of these employees are paid 50-50 by us and NRCS. And so through their NRCS role, they, you know, leverage farm bill dollars and help implement conservation practices across farms and ranches in a pretty, you know, traditional way for NRCS. But then sort of the way I think about it is through their PointBlue money, they're able to then also do some ecological monitoring on a subset of properties. And so we've engaged, you know, hundreds to thousands of producers through this program. It's been around since I think it's like 2011, 2012, and we've engaged hundreds to thousands of landowners. We've leveraged, you know, millions of dollars in farm bill funds to help implement these practices. And so it's a really great way or model to be able to form trusted relationships with producers in a way that then allows us to collect data in what I think is sort of an unprecedented spatial scale. So these partner biologists and some additional help through field techs and such collect ecological metrics on a subset of these properties that they engage with. And we have sort of a standardized approach for looking at some metrics of ecological function that we have deemed relevant and likely important for rangeland systems in California. So, you know, we, again, sort of us having our history in wildlife monitoring and birds in particular, of course, we do some bird monitoring. We layer on top of that vegetation monitoring, and then we also look at some soil properties that are conceivably responsive to management, and some that aren't, some inherent properties as well. I'll talk more about how we do all of that monitoring in a second, but I just wanted to show sort of the scope of where we're at with this. So these circles on the map are sort of blown out circles so that they're not really sort of precise in their location to because there, you know, we have some rules about if and how we can share that information from a location standpoint. And so to sort of protect the landowners, we have we show these bigger circles here. And we're at around 420 locations, 85 properties in over 25 counties. Like any good program has, hopefully, we have goals for our monitoring. So the goals of the monitoring network are to establish baselines and monitor change over time. We want to evaluate the effects of grazing and other management practices. We also want to understand the relationships between ecological metrics. So, you know, there are theories of change for how management will influence the soil, for instance, and how different soil properties will sort of relate to or talk with plant dynamics, right? And so there's these linkages that have varying levels of evidence to them, and so we're interested in sort of better understanding that and capturing those within our system. And then, so that's a lot of science that we do around it, and then, but sort of equally, a goal is to provide information directly back to the landowners to help guide decision making. I'm gonna spend some time getting in the nitty gritty of what we do. I thought this group might appreciate that. And then I'll scale back out to talk about sort of how we use this information. So when we're have located, so the properties that we monitor are non-random, right? These are people who have shown interest in having monitoring done on their property. They're people who we have, or we have capacity to monitor there, and we have partner biologists in the area, right? And so the properties themselves are non-random. Up until this point, there's certainly ways that we could change that to fill in spaces that we might want to target. But at this point, that's sort of where we're at. When we're within a property, we set up a sort of 250 meter sampling grid, and then we use some programs in R to select a spatially balanced random subset of candidate locations. And then as sort of the users, then we stratify those candidate locations to make sure that we have some sampling locations that are representative of both soil and vegetation types across the property, but also management. So the idea here is that we're capturing sort of like the overarching management and soil and vegetation from a property. This type of monitoring is not intended to, target necessarily specific management practices that are done, right? So for riparian restoration or oak plantings or things like this, it might not capture that. But sort of these broad brushstrokes, this is how we get at sort of grazing management and the ecology of these ranches. From a point, so once we've identified the points, which vary, the number of points per property vary based on the size of the property, but also our capacity. So properties have anywhere between 1 and 40 points. And you can imagine then that adds some challenges from on the back end, and sort of our inference really from a science standpoint comes at the network scale. Within a point, we have sort of, we layer on these metrics that we look at. So we sort of map out a 50 meter radius circle, and within that we take 5 soil samples, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. We also do sort of layered right over that that circle vegetation analysis using line point intercept, and then we also do point counts there. And so that sort of opens the radius. It's, I think, 300 meters. But what's cool about that then is that we have this layered ecological data from each point. We do also try to collect grazing management information. We do this through surveys, and it's at the ranch scale. So there is a little bit of disconnect on a spatial level to sort of how we aggregate the grazing management information and sort of what the and where the sort of the point level. It's a challenging one to get. The grazing management information is challenging to get, but we do collect it, and we do try to make sense of it. For soil properties, we look at soil organic carbon and soil texture. We look at bulk density, water infiltration, and then we also do bare ground. For soil texture, we look at soil texture and soil carbon. We sample from 0 to 10 centimeters and then 10 to 40. So this allows us to sort of capture a deeper look while minimizing effort, right? So it's, it was sort of a compromise there, is to bulk across 10 to 40. So we take those samples, 5 different sub points within that 50 meter radius circle. We composite them for soil carbon and texture, and then we ship those off for analysis at University of Idaho. We take, at those same points, we take bulk density of the surface, so that's 0 to 7.5 centimeters. We take it at those 5 times, and then we work with the average when we're looking at the at network scale. And then we do the same thing for water infiltration. We use a single ring infiltrometer, and we take 5 measurements at those same points and typically average them. Same with bare ground. The intent with our monitoring network is to be able to capture change over time. And so we have designed a way to go back to those same points and sort of offset them by a meter so that we are minimizing confounding space for time. And we go back every 3 years. So this is just an example of the number of samples we're working with. And we think about these in cohorts because we started in 2014 and we sampled something like 150, we took 150 samples that first year. And then we went back in 2018 to those same samples or same points and took more samples. So that's cohort A. And then in 2015-16, we added another cohort of samples, which were then resampled in 2018-19. And so on. That'll happen. We're currently resampling the 2016-17 cohort right now. And then we'll just sort of keep shuffling through that way. And we have, up until this point, gotten pretty good access to back to the sites that we initially resampled from. It can be challenging if we lose a partner biologist in an area, but so far we've had pretty good success. This is just an example of the grazing management information that we can aggregate. It's pretty broad brushstrokes at this point. This is on the left, an example of, did you rotate your cattle or not on your property? Is it grazed or ungrazed? Frequent rotation is you move them something like more than once a month. Infrequent is that you move them less than once a month, and then, no rotation or ungrazed. So again, pretty big buckets. It's better than what's out there in the literature for California right now. So if we can start to make sense of sort of and draw relationships between grazing management and changes in some of these outcomes, I think it could be informative. And then on the right-hand side, you have animal units per acre. And again, by these sort of just different geographic regions. There's a challenge here, though. I think I said this before, is that this is property level summaries, which has a little bit of a mismatch with our point locations. Okay, so once we collect our data, what do we do with it? Well, we are lucky at PointBlue to have, because we have a history of long-term monitoring, we have an entire informatics team here that designs and supports databases, and in particular the one that we help to run and support is the Avian Knowledge Network. I can't go into too much detail about the back end of this. What I'll say is that my understanding of how all of this works is that it's a very adaptive database, so that you can and it's designed so that different projects using different protocols can be input in a standardized way, and that data can be summarized and output in data tables and shared with different sharing levels to end users. You can also use it to create a lot of summaries and graphs in addition to just downloading sort of the raw data. And we at PointBlue, we use this database. We house over 1 billion ecological observations in this database. And so the Rangeland Monitoring Network was lucky to be able to sort of leverage our informatics team to adapt it to our project and our protocols. And so when I go in, I don't input data, I'm not the one collecting all of it, but I can go in as an end user and pull down data, searching by property or the entire network, and I can delineate dates that I'm interested in, and I can pull down Excel files or CSV files for any of these different data sets that I want to. And of course, I pull down the soils data more often than I touch the bird data, and it's a really nice and sort of easy way to get this in a summarized format. From using the data, so I pull it down and we want to do science around it, and we want to share it. We also would love to use it for policy things, right? So the state is increasingly investing and interested in the ability of working lands to help mitigate climate change. And there's a lot of documents that go around that, from sort of doing carbon stock inventories, for instance, and parameterizing models to estimate changes over time. And I think that our data can contribute to this. And so, you know, but first things first is that we're working on private lands, and we need to have data privacy and sharing agreements. And so this is something that that we have to be very cognizant of, and we ask all of our landowners to sign one. And we offer them sort of 3 levels of sharing that they can sign on to. The top one is sort of, you can use my data, you can share my locations, and you know, you can publish it, but also share with collaborators if needed. So that's sort of like full access, the way I think about it. And then all the way down to 3, where it's you can publish my data, I don't want it to reveal specific locations, and you cannot share with collaborators. And so in all cases, we can, you know, we can use it for publication, but sort of how we use it and how we can leverage it is going to vary based on these different levels. And I'm going to then just spend a couple of slides talking about I know the point of this isn't necessarily to say what we're finding, but I want to show how we've been trying to use these data. So as just one example right here, carbon stocks from 0 to 10 centimeters and then 0 to 40 centimeters, our costs are now. So this has not changed over time at the baseline, and separated by region. So the Central Coast is, you know, right along the Pacific Ocean. Sacramento and San Joaquin Valleys are the Central Valley, hotter and drier. And you see these regional trends. I think that's great. It can help with target setting. And then we can get an idea of sort of the importance of rangeland soils from a sort of carbon storage standpoint. So doing just very sort of back of the envelope paint by numbers with these data, you know, you get something around 1,200 teragrams of carbon to 40 centimeters depth, and that's more carbon than all of the vegetation in California stores above ground. And so right there, we can show the importance of rangelands from an avoided conversion standpoint. We can also look at changes over time, which is super fun and exciting. So this is the top graph is looking at changes in soil carbon stocks from 0 to 10 and then 10 to 40 centimeters for the 2 different cohorts that we have information for right now. The black is the first cohort, the gray is the second cohort. And our rangelands have lost carbon between 2014, 15, and now. And a lot of that, I would imagine, has to do with the drought that we've been in. But we're really interested in trying to understand and sort of tease apart a lot of that variability in sort of the magnitude and direction of soil carbon change. And so we can pull in a lot of the information that we gather you know, from our vegetation data, but also using things like digital elevation models and such to try to explain that variability across the state. One of the things that we're challenging ourselves to do is bring in the management of information, but again, it's a tricky linkage that that we need to spend a little bit more time on. And then you know, there is that sort of separate goal that that really is informed by our science, but and is certainly just as important, which is to provide this information back to the landowners. And we don't have a super sophisticated way of doing this right now. What we do is we generate landowner letters where each of our partner biologists draft summaries, essentially data summaries and interpretation for the landowners. They share this document with the landowners, and then we'll follow up and do a site visit to talk about all of that information. And what's cool is that these are sort of trusted relationships. We engage with them over time, sort of from start to finish. And so there's a lot of buy-in from the ranchers. They really are interested, and we're able to sort of co-create knowledge with them around this information, interpreting it on their site, et cetera. Right now, here's just 2 examples. Like, producers that we work with, I imagine this would be across the board. They love maps. Like we find maps are very engaging, and so this is just an example of, this is bird data that we would maybe put in a landowner letter, and we can do this for all of our metrics. And then, you know, we find ways to interpret some of the soil health parameters, which, you know, they're only as good as how well you can interpret them for your system. And so, you know, this is an example of using bulk density data defined by soil texture. So the blue are coarse textured soils, the red are fine textured soils, and comparing them to NRCS thresholds for soil compaction above which root growth might be restricted. So these are some of the ways that we can interpret them. We are heading in a direction where we're using our network to actually begin to inform interpretation. And we want to do it in an interactive way, right? So where somebody can go online and input data or interactively explore their landowner letter. So this is just an example of one of the things that I've been working on, which is the soil health curve. Many of you may recognize it, you know, Cornell Soil Health puts, you know, a lot of these out and uses them for their interpretation. And so we're trying to do the same thing derived from our data set. So this is just an example of soil carbon. This is the Central Coast, looking at soil carbon by soil texture. And you know, if you're a producer, even if you're not in our network, you could think that if we had something online and you could input a soil sample that you took for 0 to 10 centimeters, and you had something like 3.5% soil carbon on a fine textured soil, you could show that 40% of the samples that are like yours in our calibration set had values lower than yours. So you can start to get a sense of where you lie compared to sort of all of your neighbors who are like you. And I think that's it. And hopefully that's left us enough time for a good discussion.
Thanks so much. I've got lots of questions from my end, but I'll open it up to others to take the lead. And if there's any gap, I'm going to jump right in.
Awesome.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions too. This is Steve Rosenzweig from General Mills. I'm a soil scientist here working on our regenerative ag work. There's just a lot of overlap in what we're doing, so I'm really kind of curious on a lot of the details on what you're doing. Just quickly, could you just tell me what the what kind of technology are you using for the surveys, like the management surveys on the livestock end?
Yeah, the data that I showed you, that's all derived from like surveys. Like we sit down with them and help them fill out just a questionnaire. We have worked with technologies like PastorMap to try to collect more in-depth information at a pasture scale, but that's not something that we deploy consistently across our network or anything.
Okay, that makes sense. And just one more question. So that avian knowledge network, that big database of bird data, is that just kind of internal to PointBlue, or is that open for projects outside of the ones that you're working on to upload data to, or like do you link with other large scale databases on birds, something like stuff like eBird?
Yeah, so we house all of the eBird data. So Cornell does, but then we also house it. Yeah. So we certainly, it is not just internal. We are being, and some folks on this call have heard quite about this, but we are becoming FedRAMP certified. So it's the sort of ability for us to have, security considerations in place that we can harbor federal data. So we do that for certain federal agencies. We harbor project data, and then and we can certainly harbor, and sort of store, and other people can input. It's not even that it has to go through us. Sort of like anybody can input if we were working with them to input data into this avian knowledge network in a way that can then, hopefully be like harmonized and aggregated So for instance, like, we were talking with some folks at ARS who are on this call who, about maybe, potentially, whether or not this type of platform can be used to input veg data that's similar across, that's being collected by different organizations. And that's something that's totally, totally doable. We would just have to figure out how, what that actually looks like.
And by veg, you mean land cover, vegetation?
Yeah, so we were talking specifically about the line point intercept data from our monitoring network and others. But you can input any protocols, like, right? So we can develop it so that it can, I think one of the beauties of it is that it's at once very like rigorous and standardized and adaptable. So you can put in any protocol and develop input parameters that are based on that protocol. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Oh, Steve, I was just going to ask the same question, and I wonder if you might actually go into a little bit more depth in terms of how external groups access that database and where those resources are located in order to both, or what the process would be to create new input forms, and also again how that data is then accessible in different forms.
Yes, I wish I could, and I fear that I will become out of my depth very quickly. I did invite our chief information technology officer to join, because I thought folks might have questions on this, and he unfortunately could not make it. But what I would propose is, if folks are really interested in this, that we maybe set up another time where Michael Fitzgibbon, who is our Chief Technology Officer, can join us and answer all these questions better than I can.
Fantastic. I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
Good. Others? And if not, I'd love to invite the Land PKS folks to maybe sort of jump in and talk a little bit about some of the conversations that you have been having, and sort of where that came from and where you see that conversation going.
So there's a couple of different angles here, and the one that we've explored most extensively so far is one that Sarah's working on. I think Sarah's on the phone as well, which is actually Chelsea referred to it, the possibility of some sort of database integration and really taking advantage of the fact that we have a single method that is being used to collect a wide variety of variables on vegetation cover and composition across the United States, that also is being used by PointBlue. And so there's a tremendous opportunity to further expand that already 60,000 plot data set with another 500 or so plots that PointBlue is using. And I think that it looked like, Chelsea, your bare ground measure is also based on a point measurement based on the photograph, at least. It looked like a grid point sort of approach. So again, very compatible. The other piece that we haven't explored as much, but I'm hoping we'll have a chance at Bassinas or Sarah will there, is Land PKS itself as a way to, and again, Doran, you and I have had these conversations now for the last couple of years, well, it's Farm OS, but Land PKS actually presents sort of a light version and an opportunity maybe for landowners themselves to get in and expand the number of points that are being monitored on their farm or ranch. Because it only takes about 20 minutes and all they need is a yardstick, and they're basically collecting data that go into a common database where we could combine it and deliver it to the ranchers, and we're exploring a lot of the same things as well, in a way that would allow them then to get a much finer grain sort of picture of what's going on their ranch. And so I think there's some tremendous opportunities there, and then maybe that we haven't explored as much. And then maybe also on the sort of citizen science outside of the ranch owners and K-12 education side as well, given the ability to do things like, and I love this photo that we're all looking at right now. We have a very similar one from Iceland, actually, that we use a lot, where we have a variety of international students that came to Iceland and have their hands outstretched with a texture ball. in their hand that they've used to texture the soils and the different colors and so forth. So I think a lot of opportunities there, but we just started those conversations. So I should probably not go any further and let Sarah and Chelsea.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff, this is Chelsea. I think you captured it really well. And we definitely look forward to continuing these conversations about all of those aspects that you just brought up.
Sarah, anything to add before we jump into the next set of questions?
I don't think so. I guess I'll just second and third what Chelsea and Jeff said.
Great. Well, I'm going to pause to allow somebody else, but like I said, I've got a whole list here. Anybody else want to jump in? Okay, I was curious, Sarah, what data visualization tools you're using and what you like, or what's being really well received by your landowners, and researchers for that matter.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, that is. Yep.
Okay. So what data? So I think the landowners, they really, like I mentioned this, they really are engaged with maps, and they really like the maps that we present. So having sort of that kind of visual, I think can be very powerful. But we at this point, when we provide that information back to them, it's all printed or in a PDF. So we don't have much that's interactive except for at Tomcat. So now Tomcat, we do have, they have all of their data online, and it's interactive. And so there we have some summaries, some graphs, but most of it is a map of the ranch where we show all the data for different points that we collect. And that's something that we've thought about building out for the entire network, and just haven't sort of had the opportunity to do so. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. But basically, map-based time series data is essentially where you're headed in general with working with landowners.
Well, I mean, I think maps are very powerful. I also, like I showed you the soil health curves. I mean, I think that kind of thing can be really informative from an interpretation standpoint. Now, I haven't actually rolled that out or used that with any landowners, so I'm not sure how they'll react. But yeah, I think we're going to try to go sort of online or web-based. I think would be great. Now, I wouldn't want that at the expense of sitting down with the landowners themselves, because I think that is also really a big part of this, is that in-person engagement. And then, yeah, from my experience, they're very responsive and enjoy the maps, because they get to look at the points and say, oh, I know what happened there, or, which is, can make you have some heartburn sometimes, because it's not maybe representative of, there's challenges there, but I think that can be something that's really engaging.
So I also had a question in terms of, you mentioned that you're doing some type of stratification approach in your sampling. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that in terms of what's going in. You mentioned soil type and cover, mm-hmm. but maybe a little bit more detail. And also, it's been a pretty hot topic with this group in terms of the next generation of Stratify and building a tool around that. So I guess mm-hmm. I would just love if you wanted to go into a little bit more depth in terms of how you're thinking about that, or whether that's something that you're also actively looking at in terms of improving tools or sophistication around sampling methodology.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So right now so once we have our sort of like spatially balanced subset of points, the stratification by soil type and veg and management is sort of up to each partner biologist. And we do have, right. So
So it's not an algorithm. It's not. Okay.
Nope, it's not. And certainly it could benefit perhaps from being a little bit more random perhaps. But on the flip side, we have also talked about allowing on each property to have the producer choose a point like that they really want, right? Because if we want them to be very engaged and interested in these data and sort of capitalize on that, one thing that we've explored is sort of whether or not it might make sense to have them pick a point that's really of interest to them. And so that would sort of take us the opposite direction. But
not necessarily mutually exclusive either.
Exactly. And we could certainly flag those points and treat them differently if we felt we needed to, and yeah, so that's sort of where we're at with that.
And are you in their soils data, are you including slope or aspect as part of that?
Yeah, we do. We try to. Yep. So we try to have based on the soil series, we're trying to take into account the slope at least and stratify accordingly. Now, sometimes we are very limited. Like on some of these properties, we're only taking a handful of samples, and so your inference is going to be is also going to be limited. But yeah.
Chelsea, I've forgotten. Are you using the dominant map unit component, and you told me before, I think, or are you actually going out and verifying the soil at those locations?
Yeah, so we do not do a whole lot of verification. So we'll pull up a soil map essentially. So what I showed, in all of these slides before. So this is taken directly from our handbook, and so we'll pull up sort of a map and delineate soil types and choose from that. And we do not do a ton of verification in the field.
So given how much time you're spending and the value of the data, that may be another place for LandPKS and simply doing and you've already collected a lot of the data that we'd use to run the algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
And so we may be able to work with you to run that. That's something else. We don't have a batch system yet, and it's something that we're sort of trying to figure out how to implement from a number of perspectives. But certainly going forward, basically for a lot less time than it takes you to collect bulk density and infiltration data, you could actually get that level of resolution, which in California may be even more important because the quality of the soil maps is lower than it is where an awful lot of our folks are working in the Midwest.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think that's a really good idea. Yeah.
So I'd like to also prompt, perhaps go back to Steve to just check in on your biodiversity approach and whether there's some intersection there, because I know we're, as a group, although we're fairly soils focused, are interested in drawing connections between soils, land cover, and biodiversity measurements. And certainly insight into the massive database that you're working is one approach to making sure that the data is interoperable across different projects. But I guess I would like to sort of just touch on that, because that's certainly something that we're looking at over the long run, is approaches other than just one big database to create interoperability for these data sets as we're collecting them on farm across different production systems and geographies and so forth.
Yeah. So I have my in-depth session tomorrow where I'll be kind of going into a lot more detail on all this. Chelsea, it'd be awesome if you could attend that.
Yeah.
Just to get your kind of eyes on what we're doing. But it's really similar. All of our systems are cropland systems. So there's some differences in just sampling density and things like that, but we are doing kind of like you have here, we're doing soils tests a lot of them are very similar. In that same area, we're doing insect bioinventories where we're taking a soil core and basically shining a hot lamp on it and seeing everything that crawls out and identifying everything down to species level. We're also doing sweep netting and just understanding who all is in the plant canopy. And then we have some wildlife ecologists from Applied Ecological Services that are doing similar kind of bird assessments. So most of our fields are kind of in that like 60 to 100 acre range, and so they've picked 2 points on either field corner, and they're listening for 10 minutes. I need to get more details on the methodology before tomorrow, but they're basically doing this sort of ranged approach where they're just listening. They're kind of marking how far each bird is. So we have similar sort of reports to you that you showed for the farmers, where we're trying to compare, show the farmers, bird, like all the different bird species in their fields and abundances relative to some other farmers in their region. Same thing for insects, same thing for soils. We're doing a little bit of plant analysis. I mean, like for croplands, it's not as interesting to look at the plants that are out there because they're basically just planting, in most cases, one type of crop. But we are doing some satellite imagery analysis to understand, to use as like covariates, like, what is the habitat surrounding the field? Because that's going to be such a huge driver for what we actually find in the field. So we're doing some vegetation transects to ground truth what the satellites are telling us in terms of that habitat. So that's kind of the high level overview of what we're doing, but we're doing that on about 50 croplands up in the northern plains of North Dakota, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, and pretty soon here this spring on about 36 fields in Kansas.
Oh, cool. That's great. Yeah, I think it'll be really good to have. I'm glad to hear that you guys are sort of layering, sort of diversity analyses or metrics on top of some of the soils and other things that are that you guys are looking at. And from our perspective, one of the things I would love to do with our data set is to sort of ask, okay, across space and time, do these things tend in the same direction? Are there trade-offs, right? So it's like, do your really high carbon sites, are they also going to harbor lots of bird diversity? And you can think of reasons why they might not, or they might, and so I think that those kinds of questions will be, from my perspective, really important to ask.
Yeah, it'd be good to compare notes once we have more data. We really just started last year. So once we have more data, just to kind of see how you're doing the analyses to compare these different types of data. So yeah.
Cool.
Good. Well, unless there are any burning questions, we're at the top of the hour. So I'd really like to thank Chelsea for joining us. And as usual, there's so many more questions, and sounds like we'll have a follow-up that's more tech focused, and try to get that on the calendar. Perhaps maybe right after the Piscinas meeting would be a good timing for that.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds great.
So we'll look forward to it. And thank you all for joining. And please join us tomorrow with Steve.
All right. Thank you so much.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.